Our next speaker is Dr. Curtis Keith, Chief Scientific Officer at Blavatnik Biomedical Accelerator in the Harvard Office of Technology Development.
So, thank you to the organizers for the invitation. I think watching the first few presenters in this panel, it occurs to me that I didn't have very far to travel compared to everybody else. I just walked across campus. I'm just 10 minutes walk away. So, I see some folks that look like maybe they're student age or postdoc age, and I'm in the Smith Campus Center, so you're probably familiar with, that's where the international office is, actually. So, in any case, I'm here to tell you about a program that I run at Harvard, which has the purpose of trying to increase the commercial potential, actually, of Harvard's biomedical technologies. And of course, for Harvard, that's primarily with the greater goal of getting our biomedical technologies out there to benefit society. I think there's a kind of these two sides to our program, which is there's also an economic development side to this, and a kind of a revenue return to the university, and I'll touch on both of those. But I think that in the context of today's discussion, that I think there is an applicability also of a program like the one that I run at Harvard. And so I should explain that quite often, I travel around the world, meeting with universities and regions that are thinking of setting up programs like this. And actually, in the last couple of years, I had the fortune of being able to go to Latin America a couple of times. I was in Argentina and Colombia last year, speaking at universities or in regions there. And I made this one slide, which is really specific to today's discussion, which is, we've got great researchers here from Latin American universities. It goes without saying, I think you would know that. There's really great strength within Latin American universities, and maybe differentiating strength, particularly with regard to diseases that are of specific interest and concern in the region, right? Probably that's where, not always, but that's where some of the greatest depth and strengths are for researchers. And, in some cases, the ones we're talking about today primarily would be infectious diseases, but there are also diseases that tend to be of particular concern to regions which are not infectious diseases. And very often, the strength within the universities is as a result or promoted by funding support from national funding agencies, which then again helps to support that. But I think that it's important to say that that does not solve the problem that universities still face major challenges with regard to developing to a significant level of development and commercializing their biomedical technologies. That is still a problem generally even with federal funding that is out there, and it's certainly true within the U.S. as well. And so, this last bullet is really just to make the point that I think we should keep in mind that more effective translation of this kind of research into products really should be a goal for all of us, because it helps to benefit patients and society, and also, when done well, it does help to promote economic development in the regions. And I think that does also feed back to benefit everybody. And so I would put forth the idea that programs like the one that we have here at Harvard, which is a university-based program, but there are versions which are not based at universities, but these can help to facilitate this development and commercialization of university technologies. So, just a little bit about, I won't take too long with this, actually. I realize we're running a little bit behind time, so I'll just try and I'll skip over some things. But I should explain that, we set up this program about 10 years ago, and this is how we define what the need is. That university research, and that is equally true at Harvard. It's viewed as being highly innovative. I think all, industry realizes that the future products, that will benefit everybody very often will originate from universities, but it's seen as being usually too early for venture capital investment, for startup formation, or or for licensing to existing biopharmaceutical companies. That it's, and that, people say, oh, but is that really true at Harvard? I think it's even more true at Harvard very often, that what we're doing here at the university is really basic fundamental research. And sure, companies come knocking on the door and say, what do you have? But when we describe it to them, they'll often say, oh, well, okay, come back to us in 5-10 years when it's a little more developed. And we have the problem that federal funding and the grants that conventionally our investigators could access rarely support the proof of concept studies that are needed to de-risk our technologies. So we created this accelerator with the goal of getting more of our technologies to the stage where companies would be interested. And the idea is that, with very focused funding of specific de-risking proof of concept studies that are based on input from discussions we've had from investors and companies, that it should be possible to get a greater rate of partnering of our technologies. A little bit of history of the program. We started this about a decade ago. That's when I came back I was a student here at Harvard in the early 90s, and I came back to start this program 10 years ago. We originally had $10 million in gifts from very generous Harvard alumni. And then in 2013, we expanded the program with a gift from the Blavatnik Family Foundation. And Len Blavatnik was Harvard Business School alum. And we received a $50 million gift at the university, $35 million of which is for my program. The core strategy is that what we fund and how we go about this, it's very driven by business development. And what I mean by that is that before our process to choose what we're going to fund and how we're going to fund it is based on discussions that we have with companies and investors. So I'll explain the process in a little more detail on the next slide, actually. So the kinds of exits that we're looking for our program are startup formation, or as I said before, licenses to existing biotech and pharma, and also major sponsored research agreements with pharma, for example. Those are also very meaningful to our PIs at Harvard. We have an independent advisory committee that helps us decide what we're ultimately going to fund. We do a lot of diligence on any technology before we fund it. And this was set up as an evergreen fund. So the idea is that this program should ultimately be self-sustaining and that 20% of any of the license revenue that Harvard receives for these partner technologies will be returned into our fund. And that includes upfront milestone payments when we receive those, but also sale of equity in startup companies, and then hopefully one day royalties on product sales, which of course is, for therapeutics, which is primarily what I work on, pretty far down the road. But, we would receive 20% of any royalties that Harvard receives. I won't go through all of this except to say, we've spent a long time developing a kind of a systematic process, which one view of what we're doing is taking this groundbreaking biomedical research at Harvard and trying to create from that partnerable technologies. There are 4 major stages that we're involved in, which are identifying opportunities around the university and then evaluating those. And then, there's a pivotal point when we select projects that will become part of our portfolio of active projects. Then there's kind of the management phase, which can be 2 to 3, 4, even longer years, actually, where we manage the projects with the investigators. And then at the end of it all, partnering it, hopefully, when projects succeed. So where does this stand after 10 years? We've funded about 93 projects. Actually, we just funded a few more, so we're up to 97 projects. Those have received $20 million in direct grants. In general, we provide somewhere in the range of maybe $100,000, $300,000 per grant, but per project. But actually, there are cases when projects are succeeding and they need more to get to an exit, where we'll provide more. And actually, I took out the example, but one of probably our best success in recent years was a technology for acute myeloid leukemia, where we ended up funding it to about $1.5 million. And then it was licensed to Merck, and we received $20 million up front for it. from Merck, and then are eligible to for additional milestone payments and royalties. We've worked with 75 investigators to date, which would range, I know there's some Harvard folks in the audience, and this ranges from, very well-established, well-known Harvard PIs to, the young PIs who are not tenured and really just getting started. And in a lot of cases, they're the ones who benefit most, I think, from a program like this. And really, it's a broad range of technologies. You can see, kind of how they break out in that graphic to the right. But it's primarily therapeutics, but not exclusively. And there have been some vaccine technologies in the last couple of years. Actually, I don't know how I grouped the vaccines in there. But in terms of outcomes and how to measure this, so we're quite proud of the conversion rate of projects to partnerships. To date, it looks like about half of the projects that we complete are able to enter into some sort of partnership with industry. Now, yeah, and I think it's actually probably about 43% now. It's gone down a little bit in recent years because we started to provide smaller grants for more risky projects, which are pilot grants. But I think really, still it's somewhere in the range of probably 40%, I think is what we're heading toward. And those have brought in, now it's more than $22 million in license revenue. And I think importantly, as I said, from, one of the most desirable things from the standpoint of our researchers is that this has also brought in significant sponsored research funding. And we've for the projects we've funded, that then have been partnered, we've been able to bring in more than $30 million of additional sponsored research funding to continue the work and the research in those labs. We've had 14 startup companies come from our program, which, from the perspective of regional economic development, that's employed, hundreds of employees, certainly. I think, at this point, it could easily be 1,000 employees. There are a few startups where they took our technology and another technology. So, do you cut that in half? I'm not sure. But equally, the amount of money that's been raised for those companies is actually at this point, it would be in excess of $1 billion of equity investment into the startup companies. I think also an important outcome for our projects that should be kept in mind is that this is leading to the filing of new patent applications. We have follow-on grants that the PIs are able to apply for and receive based on the research. The publications, obviously, funding from foundations as well. And last, I would just say from this standpoint, we see this as a program which really goes beyond just the individual exits and outcomes, but rather it's meant to be kind of a investigator educational experience and, kind of encourage entrepreneurship among our investigators at Harvard as well. And that kind of has this lasting value that goes beyond just the individual projects that come to an end at some point. Maybe I'll take a minute just to talk about this example of one of the projects that we funded through. This was a technology from the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology, just a few hundred feet away. And this was from the Professor Andy Myers. And this Andy, maybe some people in the room will know Andy. He's one of the world's best known synthetic chemists. And maybe about 10 years or so ago, he kind of retooled his whole research program to really focus on developing very practical syntheses of these natural product-based antibiotics that we're also familiar with, and that traditionally have been developed based on fermented products, and then semi-synthesis that is performed on the fermented products. And Andy, his I think philosophy or his hypothesis, I guess, based on his work was that if you can develop practical total syntheses of these, then you're going to be able to achieve ultimately much more with these compounds than has been possible to date. So I think everybody knows one of the greatest limitations that is faced with the natural product antibiotics is that resistance develops, and you can do some semi-synthesis, you can do ring expansion. So in the case of the macrolides, azithromycin is a ring expansion through a simple not that simple reaction, but you're still quite limited in how you've been able to change the look of the capability, the possibilities of that antibiotic. And so we funded Andy to develop a total synthesis of this of the macrolide scaffold, and then over the course of the project, he further optimized the synthetic route. He'd already started working on it. He developed a total synthesis of many hundreds of novel antibiotics. He was able to show in MIC panel testing that he was starting to find really unprecedented activities for macrolides in terms of gram-negative activities and resistant gram-positive activities that just had not been seen before. And so it was very encouraging. We got it to the point where we had, over the course of 2 years and about $300,000 investment, we had really strengthened the intellectual property, including the composition of matter of key intermediates for the synthesis. And we had, I think, generated some proof of concept for the platform. We didn't claim that any of the compounds were going to be the next drug. That was not what we claimed. But we said this is a platform technology that, that now in a scaled up industrial environment should be able to really generate compounds that really truly may be drug leads. And so a few years ago, we did a startup company that initially raised $22 million called Macrolide Pharmaceuticals. They've since raised, I think, another maybe $15–20 million. And, that's sort of a nice going concern, that company. So that's one example. In other cases, as I mentioned, some cases we fund a very specific discrete compound like our AML compound, but this was a platform. I'll just say a little bit about this. This is a fellowship program we have through Harvard Business School as well. And again, I think a lot of universities have either very good business schools associated with them, or have very entrepreneurial individuals within the university that maybe are not the scientists. In some cases, they are the scientists. But something like this, I think, can be applied elsewhere. In the case of Harvard, the way that we do this is that we take 5 MBA postgrads every year to come back and work with us to identify a biomedical technology from within Harvard, where their goal is then to launch a startup company. And for me, I try and convince them to work on accelerator technologies, but we don't limit them to just working on accelerator technologies. And they've been very successful. We've been doing this for 5 years, and there are 15 startup companies that have come out of it, and they've raised a good amount of money so far. And there are a couple of them, again, the timelines to products, who knows exactly how they'll play out. But I think it's a neat program that, that universities can benefit from. My last slide, I of course, most places I think that I go to speak, somebody will say, well, it's fine for you to say this, but you're in Boston. Like, Boston is a kind of a unique system. And of course, I realize that, but it's good to think about what are the components that make Boston's, vibrant ecosystem, like really make, what is it in the end, right? And so of course we benefit from major research universities, Harvard, MIT, BU, Tufts, others, UMass, the Broad Institute. But, and I think it's interesting. I've been here since 1993, and I think what I would like to say is, like, not all of this was in place when I was a student, when I arrived here 25 years ago to the U.S. And so this, I think, so, there's the first part, the major research universities, of course. This vibrant venture capital community, that was, there to some extent 25 years ago here in Boston, but it was, it certainly was nowhere near what it is now. And we really benefit from having these VCs that are very amenable to and focused on university stage technologies and the company building that's needed for those, like Third Rock Ventures, Flagship, Atlas, and so on. And I think a lot of people here would know that years ago, Massachusetts State also created the Massachusetts Life Science Center, which put in place some incentives at the state level, grants, loans, tax breaks, and so on. Now, in the last 20 years, 15 years, there have been a number of biotech incubators that have taken hold, including Lab Central and CIC. And this has resulted in, and I used to be in biotech, actually. I didn't explain that. I was at Harvard, and then I went out and started a biotech company. And the number of sort of small to mid-sized, micro-cap and larger biotech companies has just, skyrocketed. It's just exploded. And, this is as a result of, the things that precede it, right? And what's really changed in my time here is that now 9 of the 10 largest pharmaceutical companies have open R&D labs here. And that was not true when I was here many years ago. I mean, there was some presence, but really that's been a major change. And of course, that, this idea of a virtuous cycle, that then helps in the sense that funding comes back to universities now to develop products and, support research for the next cycle. And, and within Massachusetts, it's recognized that the life sciences sector is really a major driver of growth for the state. So, I think there are some, regions and cities that maybe already have a couple of these pieces in place, and others where, they say, well, we don't have as much. But I think it's good to think about a long-term strategy and vision for putting together something like this. And if not quite at the scale of Boston, Cambridge, something along these lines in other places. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.